It's William's Day, and I'm going to say a little bit first, and then we're going to hear from Beverley Sheila, and then from Sheila. Father's Day began in the 1900s, but on further research, I found it wasn't until 1996 that President Johnson officially proclaimed Father's Day a national holiday. That would be in the States. Times have changed. Fatherhood and motherhood and the respective roles have certainly been stereotyped in society. Fathers went out to work and mothers stayed at home. But with our rapidly changing times, it ain't necessarily so. These days, a father may have to take on the role of what was traditionally the role of a mother and vice versa. And in some cases, a single parent of either gender ends up having to be both mother and father to their child or children. Now with same-sex marriage, we have another way of doing the parent thing. So the traditional role of parenting has expanded, as has the consciousness of the world and society to bring this about, whether certain people or cultures like it or not. It's unfolding. So, what are the qualities of a good father or parent? Supportive, set guidelines, a good provider, and a good role model. And one, I've skipped a few here, but one of the ones that sticks out to me is, I remember what it's like to be a child. The father honours their children's feelings. And as they get older, the father is to step aside, accepting and letting go what has to happen. And we've all had that experience where we've been in a situation as a child and our parents knew what we were getting into, but the only way we learn, as we've talked about before in many of our talks, is we make the mistake ourselves and then we really get the message. And that is what our Father in heaven provides for us, that we may have the joy of self-discovery and all the blessings and challenges that entails. Unity is culturally Christian, spiritually eclectic. So I'm going to refer to Jesus because I was brought up on the Bible and it is still part of my life, more so metaphysically now, of course. The father of Jesus was called Joseph. The Metaphysical Bible Dictionary states that from the Hebrew, whom Jehovah will add to. From perfection to perfection, he shall increase progressively. Now, it may come as a surprise. We read, and it's in the Bible, that Jesus had at least 4 brothers and 2 sisters. The brothers' names, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. I wonder if that was that Judas. And one of the sisters was called Salome, and the other sister's name is not mentioned. Joseph was a carpenter and supposedly descended from the line of King David. He was a good father to Jesus. Examining his role as a father, it reveals his soul qualities reflect a balance between the masculine and feminine qualities of soul, and we're not talking about gender here. The so-called masculine are reason, intellect, and the feminine are intuition, feeling, and nurturing. Joseph protected Jesus and Mary during the dangerous times at his birth, when King Herod was on the warpath fearing his throne was being threatened. Joseph had a close link with Spirit, as was shown by the warnings he received in his dreams. And he acted promptly on that inner guidance. He was a provider, protector, and highly intuitive, a practical mystic. The last time Joseph is mentioned in the Bible was when the family went to Jerusalem for the Passover, and Jesus was 12 at the time. When the festival was over, the parents started out for home, thinking he was with them somewhere with the others. Not so. They frantically went back to search for him and found him in the temple, chatting at ease with the wonderful rabbis and priests. And I'd like to think that the great Rabbi Hillel was still around at that time and Jesus would have spoken to him. Hillel, of course, who is mentioned first of all with that wonderful law, the golden rule, do unto others. When they saw him, his mother said, "Son, where have you been? Why have you treated like this? Your father and I have worried about you." And he answered, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" And that's the last time that Joseph is referred to in the Bible. In other cultures, they put it their own way. Instead of "Our Father within," Hopi Indians speak of Spider Grandmother, who spun a great web connecting all things. To the ancient Chinese, it was the Tao, or the flow of the universe. And the Hindu Rig Veda speaks of the absolute called Brahma. And the Bhagavad Gita, "I am the father, the mother, the supporter, and the grand sire of the universe." And the one I find most comforting is from the Hawaiian kahuna tradition. The higher self is called Aumaku, which translates as totally trustworthy parental spirit. We can use whatever terminology we like, as long as it works for us. Now we're going to hear from a couple of people that are well known to us. Father stories on this day, Father's Day. Would you welcome Beverley Sheila? Beverley, welcome along, and let's hear what you have to say. Thank you. If you unmute, unmute, Beverley. I think Beverley needs to unmute. Can you?
Yes, I do indeed. I've unmuted. I'll start again. Thank you, Reverend Bill. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
My dad was born on the 15th of July, 1912 in Moonee Ponds, and he was christened William Alexander Cock. He was the youngest of 5 children. He had 3 brothers, Charles, Sydney, and Reginald, and 1 sister, Beatrice. And it's interesting that all the brothers were given abbreviations to the rest of the family. They were Uncle Charlie, Sid, and Reg, but Beatrice was always given her full name. She was Auntie Beatrice. And often when we're growing up, we aren't aware of exactly what's happening in the extended family on one side or the other, but it was always my mother's side we saw more often. My dad's father, my grandfather, died when he was very young of cancer. My dad was then only 12. So I never actually knew my grandfather on that side of the family. I think he died at about the age of 40. I'm told he was a bit of a tyrant and often sent my father to bed without his dinner. My grandmother, I'm told, used to take him some what was supposedly dry bread and a glass of milk up to the bedroom afterwards, and my grandfather would inspect it. Apparently, I'm told, she would show him the bread upside down and underneath was the butter and jam. So perhaps he actually knew, and he was a bit of a softie after all. Because my dad's older brother, Charlie, was about 20 years older, he acted a bit like a father to him for a lot of his life. Uncle Charlie was an engineer and finished up going to England and worked for British Rail. He married an English girl, never came back to Australia. Dad remained close to his other siblings, and I do remember them visiting us from time to time. I indeed did travel to England in my early 20s and met my Uncle Charlie for the first time. In about 1942, my dad enlisted in the Air Force to go and fight in that capacity in World War II. I believe he only came back to Australia once in about 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure of the facts there. This was very hard for my mother, as both my sister Judy and I were quite sickly babies, and my grandparents on the other side, my mother's side, moved in to help her. Consequently, when my dad finally came back from World War I thought my grandfather was my father and wouldn't have anything to do with him initially. So Grandma and Grandpa had to move out. And I would think that was probably the case with a lot of families in wartime. Dad was a pathfinder navigator in the war, in the Air Force. I'm not totally aware of everything he did because when he came back, he really didn't talk about it, which was quite common, I believe. As a pathfinder, his mission was to go ahead and drop flares or incendiaries, as they were often called, on the bombing sites in Germany, ahead of where the actual bombs were to be dropped. It was a very dangerous and brave job, and most of the pathfinders in Australia did not come back. My dad was one of the very few, and as such, he was decorated with the DFC, that's the Distinguished Flying Cross. This is the second highest military honour given at that time, the top being the Victoria Cross. He was also awarded the medal called the France and Germany Star, which was awarded to forces who served in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Germany between June 1944 and May 1945. Now, I don't know how clear it'll be, but I'll show you a couple of these things which I have in my possession. Now, this one is the DFC. That's a purple and white stripe. I hope everybody can see that. Is that clear, Reverend Bill? Yeah. This is the France and Germany Star. It's a bit hard to see the inscription there, but I've looked it all up, and it's for bravery and service in that area. And this was his wings for the Air Force that he used to wear on his uniform. Now, I also found, after 2 years of searching, I've got to say, I tried to find the newspaper cutting. I'll go on about that in a moment, but that was the actual piece of parchment and the award that was sent to him, saying that he was to receive the DFC. You can see the William Alexander cock there. And I found a photograph of him in one of his uniforms. There he is. Very handsome. Now, I've just got to turn on to my next page now. Where are we? This was all a very proud moment, as you can imagine, for my dad and my mum, and they went to Government House for the award. And this was published in the newspaper the next day, but I couldn't find the newspaper cutting when I found all these other things. It's interesting that also in my day, growing up in the 40s and 50s, and a lot of people will understand this, mothers usually had the most to do with the children, particularly girls. And I often have regrets that I really didn't get a chance to know my dad as well as I would have liked. He was a very happy person, as I remember, always cheerful and very active. He was musical and used to often play the piano for us. His two favourites and his specialties to perform for the relatives were the doll dance, this is on the piano, of course, and the wedding of the painted doll, which I know you're familiar with, Bill. The last one, the wedding of the painted doll, was written for the Broadway musical Broadway Melody in 1929. He also studied jazz chord structure, which of course is quite interesting to me. He met my mother when they were both working at the Shell Company. in the late 1930s, and they married in 1939. It was a happy marriage, and they gave my sister and I a very happy childhood. We moved to Hobart in about 1950 for Dad's job as a salesman for the company English Electric. This was also a very happy time for us, a lot of it spent outdoors, very free time. We came back to Melbourne in about 1956, by which time my mother was suffering very bad health. She was a chronic asthmatic, and the medication then was not that great. My dad was a very caring person and looked after her extremely well until her death at the age of 60. Among his many achievements, my dad was a keen and excellent golfer. He was a member of the Metropolitan Golf Club, and he actually made, to his great joy, a hole-in-one on the 6th hole. And it's very sad and worn, I have the hole-in-one trophy, and that was in 1961 for, I suppose, 173 yards, it says, when it was awarded. I guess that's the length of the shot. I don't know a lot about golf, but some of you will. As I said earlier, he was a very active man, and he made our garden in Hobart right from scratch. The house was built for us with a lot of digging and planting. He was also on the Kingston Council, that was south of Hobart, and in that role was lucky enough to be invited, of course with my mother, to the Queen's Ball when the Queen Elizabeth II visited Hobart in the 1950s. And I remember all the fuss about what my mother would wear. And I found the invitation with the royal crest on it, with the invitation to the ball. They must have been absolutely thrilled, I can't imagine, meet the Queen. All in all, I was a very proud daughter. I remember he was very punctual, probably came from years in the Air Force, and on my wedding day, all he could think of is that we would be on time at the church. And as I am prone to do occasionally, I was running late and nervous, and he got a bit cross. I don't often remember him being cross, but he was worried about father and daughter being late. He sadly also died in his 60s, having had a lung removed in his late 1950s with lung cancer. He was a chronic smoker, like so many at that time. Then one night he had a stroke watching television and died in his sleep. He was a great dad and certainly did his best for all of us. And just in closing, needless to say, he was so incredibly proud of my sister Judy and her success and fame with the Seekers. Well, that was a brief history of my father, and I'd just like to wish everybody out there a happy Father's Day. Thank you, Reverend Bill.
Thank you, Beverley. What a wonderful story, and thank you for sharing those wonderful artifacts with us. I haven't seen that. My father got a hole-in-one, but I don't recall him getting a trophy like that for it. I think they spent their time at in the clubhouse having a celebration champagne.
Yes, that certainly went on as well. The 19th hole, they called it.
19th hole, yes. That's what I was trying to think of.
That was it, yes. Okay. There was a bit of that.
Yes.
The poor, I think it could do with a bit of a revarnish and a bit of polish. It looks a little bit sad now.
Yeah. Is it gold or silver? I can't quite see.
The plaque is actually, it's sort of bronze with his name on it and the date.
Yes,
and the golf ball is a real golf ball sitting on the top.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
Yeah. As they were at that time, I suppose. It says XL Top Flight 4.
Right, okay.
That's the name on the ball.
Thank you very much, Beverley. Well,
it was a real pleasure to do it, and very interesting going back over the history.
Yes, it really was fascinating. And it's probably triggered off quite a few memories for a lot of others.
Well, I was thinking that.
The day goes on, the day, it's a long, we've got to get through the lunchtime session and the evening session, and memories will come flooding back, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Now, Sheila, over to you.
Well, you're in luck. My piece is quite short. Yes, well, my father was born in 1908, so he remembered the early days of household electricity. And he remembered how suddenly the world brightened up, and it caused his aunts to rush out into the backyard and smash their Tiffany lamps. Anyway, this was quite a nostalgic exercise for me because I was extremely fond of my father. And it stirred up some treasured memories. Needless to say, I admired him enormously, and we got on quite well. We seemed to share a fairly similar approach to things. But he was an enormous influence on my life, and still is really. And I found that at times quite intimidating because he was a man of so many talents and abilities. And he had a great sense of humor, though, which made him really quite approachable, certainly for me. He loved travel, music, art, literature, language, philosophy, history. He could recite poetry, had learned at school many years ago. He loved history. He actually loved the ancient world. And he was a championship fencer. He was captain of his fencing team at university, and then he fenced for Scotland at one stage. And he was even offered a contract to fence in Hollywood movies, but that was for the days of Errol Flynn, who was very good looking, he said, and he declined because he said he was not good looking enough. Yes, his eyesight suffered very, very badly from being kicked in the jaw playing rugby at boarding school. And unbeknownst at the time, all his teeth were loosened, and they became slowly over the years abscessed. And this was only found to be the cause of his loss of eyesight many years later. But he did manage to save it, and although he wore trifocals for the rest of his life, he could still see. But this meant, apart from anything else, that he was not able to be drafted in the army for the Second World War. And that was a cause of some grief to him. And he felt, I think he carried that shame that his courage had never been tested, as was so many men of that era. And it, I think, drove a bit of a wedge between him and other men who had served in the war. And he compensated by this by learning as much as possible as he could about what went on. But I think it also kept him slightly at a distance. He did not take part, if you like, in the major male bonding experience of that era. But anyway, he would not have been drafted because he was in a reserved occupation, and the government would not allow that. He served Australia in secret locations in various places where he conducted whatever he was given to do at the time, often disappearing for days at a time and leaving my mother unbeknown. You know, he couldn't tell her where he was. He became a scientist, and he had a PhD in pure chemistry and also studied engineering. So he did the first, or the early, what you might now call a double degree. And this was followed by a career in industrial management, at which he was very successful. And he was very hands-on and very practical. And at my wedding reception years ago, Neil, my then husband, spoke about his early impression of my father as formidable. And I feel pretty sure that was true for most people. But as Neil got to know him better, he started to relax. And at my wedding reception, in his speech, he spoke about my father really being a pussycat at heart. And this description caused some laughter, as you might imagine, throughout the room. It was also interesting to me because I also know that my father was known to be a cat among the pigeons in his work environment because he had the ability to shake up the status quo and traditional way of doing things and bring about the required transformations. So he showed great creative abilities and qualities in that area. And this, caused him to be involved in change and development of many factors of the industry. So the reference to Cat showed, I guess, a couple of sides of his personality. But whatever was true in the work environment, as a small child, I knew him as somebody who gave the best ever bear hugs. He made me feel encouraged and valued and safe. And most nights, after he left work for the day, no matter what was going on for the rest of the evening, he made a point of spending some time with me before I went to bed. And this was the highlight of my day. So I was very fortunate and I loved him dearly. Fathers are so important, and I'm so happy that nowadays fathers can openly express love and affection towards their children and take a much more active role in parenting. They are no longer the figures, the remote figures of previous generations. And on a more personal note, what I appreciated so much about my father was his warmth and personal presence with his family and friends. He was very generous with himself. He was always with you when he was with you. And he was able to meet people and communicate so much support just by paying attention to whatever was going on. And you felt acknowledged forever for wherever you were and encouraged. And another great talent he possessed was his ability to celebrate small things. He could make a feast out of a can of sardines. You did not need a fancy meal to believe you were experiencing something special and a special time. He acknowledged value wherever he found it. And so being with him was a positive and uplifting experience. Some ways I think it might have made us a bit lazy because you relied on him to inject his, warm, loving presence and enthusiasm into every situation. He made other people feel good about themselves and give compliments easily, and he felt optimistic about life. All qualities I respected and admired in him so much. And he used to say that it was important to savor life as much as possible, a metaphor that arises from the sensation of taste and ingestion of food and wine, which he loved. But it also hints at an imaginative quality, a sense of discovery and the conscious exploration of experience. He told me that his father had encouraged this powerful sense of curiosity in him from an early age. And his father showed great patience with him when my father had taken a pocket watch apart to find out how it worked. My paternal grandfather died tragically when my father was only 8 years old, so I never met him. But I think this early loss of his own father, who was so important to him, had left him with this heightened appreciation about the importance of family and making the most of our close relationships. It seems that my late grandfather had done everything he could to encourage my father's sense of wonder and awe at what the world had to offer. And I think this sense of wonder and awe is really a spiritual quality, one that brings us into conscious contemplation of the source and the many mysteries of life. And it seems to be an outlook that a living awareness, that is a living awareness of great potentiality. And it definitely led him into an interesting career and a broad range of experiences. My father did not know about the unity philosophy, but his character certainly represented a great deal of its ethics and virtues, and for that I'm profoundly grateful. I quite often find myself using some of his quaint sayings, such as, well, no, I don't use this one, but I remember this well. You have to remember to keep the gilt on the gingerbread, an old-fashioned tradition that is no longer practiced. I take this to mean that even and especially in life's more torrid and sad moments, we need still to remain aware of what is eternally true and good and keep our spirits as high as possible, which is possibly the epitome of human achievement. We need to remember the responsibility we all have to greatly affect the outlook of future generations. So that was my father.
Whoa, thank you, Sheila. That was wonderful. Isn't it good, the wisdom that we have amongst us that we'll all get to share eventually, we hope, and wonderful stories. Thank you to Sheila, and also thank you to Beverley as well. That was certainly put a great spin on today's Father's Day as the memories come flooding back. Let's all join now for our prosperity affirmation.